In this video, I'm going to read a story which I intend to publish in my long overdue book, Mysteries of Canada Volume 2, a collection of true Canadian stories involving some element of the mysterious, the supernatural, or the unexplained. If you'd like to get a copy of Mysteries of Canada Volume 1, please check out the link in the description. Last year's Holy Week, the week preceding Easter Sunday, was overshadowed by the tragic immolation of Notre Dame de Paris. On April 15, 2019, millions of Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians watched in horror as the vaulted ceiling of that magnificent 850-year-old symbol of Christendom went up in flames. The structure burned for 15 hours before collapsing into the nave below, mercifully damaging little of the cathedral's historic interior. Despite eclipsing it in scale, this disaster eerily evokes the cremation of another house of God by the name of Notre Dame, which took place in the Holy Week of 1885, on the northern edge of the Albertan prairies. A savage act of arson, this event played a pivotal role in a series of strange occurrences constituting one of Saskatchewan's least known and most baffling historical mysteries. 1885 was a year of transition in the Canadian West, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. That fall, the last spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the iron road connecting the easterly Dominion of Canada with the westerly province of British Columbia, and bridging the vast Northwest territories that lay in between, was driven home at Craigalatchie, BC. The ringing of the sledgehammer might have served as a summoning bell for hordes of homesteaders who would soon pour into the Canadian prairies, and as a death knell for the days of Canada's brief and fiery Wild West. By 1885, the huge herds of buffalo that had blanketed the prairies since time immemorial had dwindled to near extinction, destined to be replaced in a few short years by their domestic counterparts, beef cattle. The traders, prospectors, and wolfers who, decades prior, had comprised the Northwest Territory's only white civilian population had gradually traded in their repeating rifles and revolvers for the lasso of the rancher and the pitchfork of the farmer. And the Blackfoot, Cree, and Assiniboine Indians, who had once dominated the region on horseback, had been coerced by the Mounties, who brought law and order to the Canadian West in 1874, to abandon the nomadic lifestyle of their ancestors and settle onto reserves, where their livelihood was reduced to waiting for government rations. Naturally, there were many who were vigorously opposed to these changes that were swiftly reshaping the face of Western Canada. Foremost among these were the Métis people, the progeny of French Canadian and Scottish fur traders and First Nations women. Nearly 2 decades prior, in the wake of Canadian Confederation, the French Métis of the Red River Valley south of Lake Winnipeg had rebelled against the newly established Canadian government, fearful that Dominion agents would force them to abandon their homesteads along the Red River, which they did not legally own. The uprising, called the Red River Rebellion, was led by a well-educated Métis revolutionary named Louis Riel, who fled south to Dakota Territory when the Canadian government sent a military expedition to enforce peace in the region. By 1885, the Métis people, who had relied on the bison almost as heavily as their First Nations cousins to the west, were in dire straits. That spring, they invited Riel to return from his long exile in the United States in the hope that he might lead them once again in this, their time of need. Answering the call of his people, the Métis expatriate rode north into Canada and up the wagon-rutted Carleton Trail to the village of Duck Lake, in what is now central Saskatchewan, where many Métis had resettled following the Red River Rebellion. In no time, whispers of an impending revolution were rippling through the Canadian prairies. About 300 kilometers, or 185 miles northwest of Duck Lake, just west of the eastern border of what is now Alberta, at a place where the southerly prairie meets the boreal forest, lies the remote settlement of Frog Lake. In 1885, this tiny community boasted a grist mill, a Hudson's Bay Company trading post, a small Northwest Mounted Police barracks and stables, a Catholic mission church called Notre Dame de Bon Conseil, or Our Lady of Good Counsel, and an office for Indian Agent Thomas Quinn, who was responsible for the 3 bands of peaceably inclined woodland Cree who pitched their teepees nearby. In the spring of 1885, while Louis Riel was receiving a warm welcome at Duck Lake, 2 very different Cree bands joined their fellows at Frog Lake. One was comprised of the so-called Bush Indians, a peace-loving clan of woodland Cree who hailed from the forests to the north. The other was composed of fearsome Plains Cree from the southerly prairies, who were led by a grizzled, pock-scarred chief named Big Bear. Big Bear was a true member of the Old Guard, a man with one moccasin firmly planted in the past and the other begrudgingly thrust into the present. He was a veteran of 1,000 skirmishes and horse raids, having spent most of his adult life on the warpath against the Blackfoot, his people's hereditary enemy. He had even played a prominent role in the 1870 Battle of Belly River, the world's last great intertribal Indian battle. Like his ancestors before him, his sole occupations prior to the coming of the Mounties in 1874 had been hunting and warfare, activities which, in his mind, tested his mettle as a chief and defined his worth as a man. Big Bear detested the changes that had taken place in recent years and stubbornly refused to give up the traditional Plains Cree way of life. Hoping to retain his freedom for as long as possible, he was the last chief to sign Treaty 6, an agreement between the Canadian government and the various Cree and Assiniboine nations of what is now Alberta and Saskatchewan, which stipulated that the natives surrender their hunting grounds to the government in exchange for provisions. When the buffalo finally disappeared from the prairies and his people began to go hungry, Big Bear had no choice but to accept the terms of the treaty. Instead of settling on a reserve as had his contemporaries, however, the old chief and his band attempted to retain some semblance of the traditional nomadic lifestyle, spending nearly a decade wandering aimlessly from trading post to trading post without any buffalo to pursue. When they finally rode into Frog Lake in the spring of 1885, they were bitter, frustrated, and hungry. On March 30th, 1885, word reached Frog Lake of a battle which had taken place 5 days prior at southeasterly Duck Lake. On March 19th, Louis Riel had declared himself the leader of the so-called Provisional Government of Saskatchewan, an independent Métis state comprising much of what is now Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. When a handful of Northwest Mounted Police officers from Fort Carlton, a Hudson's Bay Company post located about 20 kilometers or 13 miles northwest of Duck Lake, on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River, had attempted to make a routine trip to Duck Lake for supplies, Métis revolutionaries had stopped them on the trail and forced them to return with a message from Riel demanding the fort's peaceful surrender. Leif Crozier, the superintendent of Fort Carlton's Northwest Mounted Police Detachment, had no intention of giving in to Riel's demands. On March 25th, he led 95 Mounties down the road to Duck Lake, where 250 Métis revolutionaries were waiting for them, having occupied a defensive position behind several log cabins at the edge of a thicket. Led by their general, Gabriel Dumont, the Métis militia engaged Crozier's force in a 30-minute firefight, which left 12 Mounties and 6 Métis dead. Heavily outnumbered, Crozier had no choice but to retreat to Fort Carlton, and thus Riel and his forces won their first victory in what would come to be known as the Northwest Rebellion. The Plains Cree at Frog Lake were encouraged by news of Riel's success, and almost overnight, Big Bear's son, Imases, determined to start his own rebellion and fight his way across the prairie to join forces with the Métis malcontents. His father, the old chief, was away on a hunting trip at the time. Eager as he was for an opportunity to change his people's pitiable circumstances, however, Imases' enthusiasm for the upcoming conflict was eclipsed by that of Wandering Spirit, a hot-headed, curly-haired sub-chief who held more sway over the band's young braves than even Big Bear himself. Wandering Spirit hated white men, and blamed them for all the problems the Cree were currently facing. When Frog Lake's 8 Mounties left for Fort Pitt, a Hudson's Bay Company post located 50 kilometers or 30 miles southeast on the banks of the North Saskatchewan, at the request of Frog Lake's white residents, who thought their presence might provoke the Plains Cree to violence, Wandering Spirit decided that the time had come to mete out Indian justice. Big Bear returned to Frog Lake from his hunting trip on the evening of April 1st, where he learned of Riel's rebellion and of Imases and Wandering Spirit's desire to take to the warpath. Weary from his journey, the old warrior went to sleep, whereupon Wandering Spirit and his most loyal braves painted their faces with blood-red vermilion and yellow ochre before stealing all the horses from the unguarded Mountie stables. The following morning, at the northwesterly St. Charles Mission, situated on the shores of what is now Muriel Lake, something extraordinary happened. This event was recorded by Bishop Vital Justin Grandin, an oblate missionary who would take down the statements of the Indian and Métis witnesses to the events of that day about half a year later in the autumn of 1885. That morning, as the sun peered above the horizon, the prairie sky took on a spectacular gradient of scarlet and crimson, as if painted in blood by the hand of God himself. On this magnificent canvas, the woodland Cree of St. Charles Mission saw 9 red crosses hovering in the southeastern sky, in the direction of Frog Lake. The Cree, whose missionary-induced Catholicism was colored by the traditional beliefs and superstitions of their ancestors, took this as an omen portending imminent disaster. Under the command of the chief's son-in-law, 25 of the Muriel Lake Cree grabbed their rifles and set out through the forest in the direction of the heavenly crosses. Back at Frog Lake, Wandering Spirit and his warriors broke into the homes of the village's white residents and seized their firearms. Riel and his half-breeds came last night and stole the Redcoats' horses, the Plains Cree lied to the bewildered settlers. But don't be afraid, we will protect you. After raiding the Hudson's Bay Company post of its knives, bullets, and gunpowder, the warriors herded most of Frog Lake's white settlers to the mission church, where the resident priest, 35-year-old Father Leon Adelard Fafard, and a visiting priest named Father Marchand were saying Holy Thursday Mass for the local Métis and Woodland Cree. In the middle of the service, Wandering Spirit sauntered into the church and genuflected in the center aisle, a Winchester rifle in his hand. According to 23-year-old Hudson's Bay Company clerk William Bleedsell Cameron, a witness of the event who described the experience in his 1926 book Blood Red the Sun, his lynx-skinned war bonnet, from which depended 5 large eagle plumes, crowned his head. His eyes burned, and his hideously painted face was set in lines of deadly menace. Never shall I forget the feelings his whole appearance and action excited in me, as I watched in stupefied amazement while he half knelt, glaring up at the altar and the white-robed priests in sacrilegious mockery. He was a demon, a wild animal, savage, ruthless, thirsting for blood. I doubted then that we should, any of us, ever again see the outside of the chapel." Unquote. Fathers Fafard and Marchand concluded the Mass prematurely on account of Wandering Spirit's hostile antics, whereupon the war chief's followers ushered most of the white settlers towards the Plains Cree camp. Wandering Spirit himself headed to the home of Thomas Quinn and ordered the Indian agent to follow his white compatriots. Quinn refused. Wandering Spirit repeated his demand twice more, and each time the government man refused to comply. "Die then," spat the war chief, raising his rifle and shooting Quinn in the head. The gunshot was like a spark in a powder keg. Immediately, a Plains Cree warrior shot Quinn's Métis interpreter in the shoulder. Another pockmarked brave then ran up to the wounded man, pressed the muzzle of his rifle against his chest, and finished him off. Chief Big Bear, who had been lounging in the kitchen of the Hudson's Bay Company post, ran towards the bloody scene bellowing, "Tesqua, Tesqua, stop, stop," in a great booming voice. His entreaty fell on deaf ears. 2 more white men, William Gilchrist and George Dill, were subsequently murdered by Wandering Spirit's unruly warriors, as were Fathers Fafard and Marchand. A Métis witness named Louis Goulet described the death of Father Marchand in his memoir, writing, "I saw Father Marchand, one of the 2 priests, fall on his knees, arms crossed, eyes raised to heaven. He was gunned down on the spot. I never saw him move again." Unquote. "Dust and smoke filled the air," wrote William Cameron. Whoops and shrieks and the ghastly clatter of galloping hooves blended in a weird and ghastly symphony. High over all swelled the deadly war chant of the Plains Crees, bursting from 100 sinewy throats. I heard the peculiarly ringing voice of Wandering Spirit, calling on his followers to shoot the other whites, and burst after burst sounded the death knell of other of my friends." Unquote. At that time, Teresa Gowanlock, the wife of a local miller named John Gowanlock, was among the crowd of white settlers who were being led to Big Bear's camp. She described her harrowing experience in a later reminiscence entitled 2 Months in the Camp of Big Bear, writing, "Mr. Williscraft, an old gray-headed man about 75 years of age, came running by us, and an Indian shot at him and knocked his hat off. And he turned around and said, 'Oh, don't shoot, don't shoot.' But they fired again, and he ran screaming and fell in some bushes." Unquote. "My dear wife," whispered Teresa's husband John in an attempt to comfort her, "be brave to the end." No sooner had he said this than he was fatally shot in the back. Teresa fell down beside her dying husband and prepared herself for the inevitable bullet. "But death just then was not ordained for me," she wrote. A Plains Cree warrior roughly hauled her to her feet just in time for her to see the murder of John Delaney, who had formerly instructed the local Woodland Cree in farming. Delaney's grieving widow, who was also named Teresa, was torn from her husband's prostrate body and made prisoner. By the time the smoke cleared, 9 white men lay dead and 4 white residents, Teresa Gowanlock, Teresa Delaney, William Cameron, and Hudson's Bay Company agent James Simpson, were held captive in the camp of Big Bear. Cameron and Simpson were spared the slaughter due to the intercession of their Woodland Cree friends, who sheltered them in their own camp after the shooting broke out. Similarly, 2 female prisoners, Mrs. Gowanlock and Mrs. Delaney, were saved from cruel usage and death by local Métis interpreters named John Pritchard and Adolphus Nolan, who purchased them from the braves who had claimed them as their wives. By the time the Woodland Cree from Muriel Lake arrived at Frog Lake, the slaughter was complete. Upon learning the particulars of the massacre, the Indians were certain that the 9 red crosses they had seen in the sky that morning were divine memorials for the 9 men who had lost their lives that day. The Plains Cree spent the evening feasting and dancing, gorging themselves on Hudson's Bay Company bacon and sacramental wine from the mission church. After mutilating the bodies of their victims, they allowed several devoutly Catholic local Métis to inter some of the bodies in empty houses and the church cellar. Others were left out in the open at the command of wandering spirit, at least one of them being propped up against a tree with a pipe jammed in his mouth in a perverse display of frontier humor. The following day, the natives witnessed a second celestial apparition, which Bishop Grandin described in a letter to the parents of the martyred Father Fafard. From the spire of Notre Dame, 2 men dressed in white rose up and ascended into the sky, much to the alarm of the natives who were present. As the ghostly figures dissipated, another vision suddenly appeared in the heavens. Witnesses described seeing an altar in the clouds, beside which sat an ethereal priest who seemed to be preparing to say Good Friday Mass. The image dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, leaving many of the Indians in a state of superstitious dread. On Holy Saturday, Big Bear's Plains Cree burned the mission church before setting fire to the rest of the buildings at Frog Lake. They whooped and sang as they watched Notre Dame burn to the ground. That accomplished, they and their Woodland Cree brethren, whom they had bullied into joining their wild crusade, made preparations to besiege the southeasterly Fort Pitt. On Easter Sunday, the Indians held a war council, spending most of the day discussing their next course of action. At nightfall, their camp was beset by a violent thunderstorm. The temperature dropped, and soon a blanket of snow carpeted the prairies. Amidst flashes of lightning, the natives saw another distressing vision in the clouds, which both Bishop Grandin and Teresa Gowanlock described in their writings. While gathered on a hillside near Frog Lake, the natives watched the phantasmal figures of 2 men rise up from the charred and smoking ruins of Notre Dame, similar to the vision witnessed 2 days prior. This time, the onlookers recognized the figures as priests. As the spectral forms rose into the air, a cloud suddenly took the form of a church. One of the phantoms entered the church, while the other, who now appeared to be riding a large black horse, held up a cross and made a gesture similar to that which a priest makes when blessing his congregation. Gowanlock, who was asleep at the time of the apparition, wrote that the vaporous priests were described as looking very angry, leading many of the Cree warriors to despair that they had, by their actions, incurred the wrath of God. For 2 months, the Cree war party roamed throughout northern Saskatchewan with their prisoners in tow. In their memoirs, Teresa Gowanlock, Teresa Delaney, William Cameron, and Louis Goulet detailed the particulars of the campaign, describing the Cree's nearly bloodless capture of Fort Pitt, the constant infighting that took place between the warlike Plains Cree and their more peaceably inclined woodland cousins, various Cree ceremonies including the agonizing thirst dance and a ritualized feast which centered around the consumption of dog stew, and the Cree's final skirmishes with government forces at the edge of the boreal forest. All the while, the prisoners, particularly those of the fairer sex, suffered from bitter cold, severe privation, and the ever-looming threat of execution at the hands of wandering spirit. One evening while on the warpath, the Plains Cree brutally executed one of their old women, whom Teresa Gowanlock described as insane, and William Cameron as senile. The Indians believed that the woman had been possessed by an evil cannibalistic spirit called a Wetigo, or Wendigo, and that she would try to eat their children if they failed to kill her before sundown. In his memoir, William Cameron implies that the woman was assigned this grim diagnosis on account of her actually expressing a desire to eat human flesh. Similarly, Louis Goulet claimed that, quote, "The old lady started ranting and raving in a fever, telling her daughter that if somebody didn't do away with her, she'd turn Wendigo after the sun went down. Unquote. Teresa Gowanlock, however, in a second memoir entitled Memories of Frog Lake, written in 1899 shortly prior to her premature death, attributes the woman's death sentence to a different cause. In this piece, which was submitted to the Montreal-based magazine Family Herald and Weekly Star by her nephew Arthur Johnson, and printed in the October 1955 issue of that publication, Gowanlock wrote that the old crone predicted that terrible things would happen to the band as punishment for the murders of Fathers Fafard and Marchand, and applied that the Cree executed her on account of her disturbing prophecies. Whatever the case, Cree warriors brought the woman to the outskirts of the camp, smashed in her skull with a war club, riddled her corpse with bullets, decapitated her, and set her severed head ablaze, an incident which both Cameron and Goulet described in gruesome detail in their memoirs. Gowanlock described a strange sequel to this ghastly incident in Memories of Frog Lake, writing, "Late in the afternoon, some days after this, toward the end of May, when we had been captive 8 weeks, as Mrs. Delaney and I were inside the lodge, we heard cries of consternation outside. We ran out to see all the band staring in fright at the sky. There, in a break among low clouds, was a representation of a church resembling that at Frog Lake, burned down nearly 2 months ago, with the bodies of the priests and the other white men. As we gazed, a priest on a white horse appeared approaching the church. Reaching it, he dismounted, stretched out his hand as if in blessing. The summer clouds closed in, and the vision faded away. Fear possessed all in the camp. The warning of the murdered old woman was recalled. The squaws, wearied by 2 months of extra labor of continually moving camp, set up a wailing. The warriors had lost the last of their courage. Even the evening meal was untouched, and now the headman began accusing the young braves of having caused the trouble. The camp did not move again. Several days later, the disheartened Cree warriors clashed with a combined force of Northwest Mounted Police officers and Canadian militia led by Mountie Sam Steele at the battles of Frenchman Butte and Loon Lake. Following their defeat at Loon Lake, the Plains Cree and the Woodland Cree went their separate ways, the prisoners proceeding under the protection of their Woodland Cree friends. The captives were finally rescued by government forces in early June and brought back to civilization. Most of the surviving perpetrators of the massacre at Frog Lake were eventually captured, although some of them escaped to Montana. On November 27, 1885, 6 of the culprits, along with 2 Cree and Assiniboine murderers from the band of Chief Poundmaker, another participant in Riel's rebellion, were executed at Fort Battleford in what was to be the largest mass hanging in Canadian history. Chief Big Bear himself, who had eluded government forces sent to capture him, eventually turned himself in at Fort Battleford. Due in part to the testimony of William Cameron, who described Big Bear as an unwilling participant in the campaign that was ascribed to him, the great Plains Cree chief was only sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment. Although there have been many books and articles written on the subject of the Northwest Rebellion, precious few make any reference to the series of spectacular celestial visions allegedly witnessed by the Cree and Métis who participated in Big Bear's campaign. Neither William Cameron nor Louis Goulet made any mention of the incidents in their memoirs. Even Bishop Grandin, who might have felt inclined to treat the visions as miracles associated with the martyrdom of Fathers Fafard and Marchand, dismissed accounts of the phenomenon as flights of Indian fancy, writing, "I am convinced that the imagination is for many, if not all, inherent in all these visions and apparitions. Even those visions which the people of Lac and Long, or Muriel Lake, claim to have seen cannot be real, if you ask me, but are attributable to the same cause, since the savages of this locality were ignorant, they assured me, of what had actually happened." All these at least proved the high esteem and veneration which the Christians had for their missionaries, and the remorse felt by the miserable people who had killed them. Unquote. Teresa Gowanlock alone gives credence to the stories, strongly implying in her second memoir, which she penned prior to her untimely death, that she herself witnessed the apparition at Loon Lake. Is Gowanlock's 1899 reminiscence the product of a fevered brain of a dying woman, an inadvertent perversion of the events described in her earlier writings? Is it a distortion of the truth written for dramatic effect? Or does it constitute the confession of a troubled soul, cognizant of its imminent reunion with its maker, intended to rectify the omissions of an earlier record born out of a fear of ridicule? Until a more illuminating source emerges from the archives of some Canadian museum or university, these questions will likely remain unanswered, leaving the miracle of Loon Lake one of the great unsolved mysteries of Canada. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help support this channel, please check out my book Mysteries of Canada Volume 1, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.